I've made it a borderline obsession on this channel with how apathetic I am towards a lot of long-running battle shonen series. Why, yes, my favourite series of all time could technically be classified as a battle shonen, that is still very much an exception amongst a somewhat steadfast rule. I never dabbled with the big three of the mid-2000s, Fairy Tail ended up as more of a slog than anything else, My Hero Academia just lost me when it started doing filler arcs that only served to complement other filler arcs, Jujutsu Kaisen and Demon Slayer are both visually stunning, but just can't really get me on board beyond that. So, with my aversion to a lot of mainstream shonen being something I'm very aware about, I have to ask myself a pretty big question. Why do I like JoJo's Bizarre Adventure then? Well, I've got two answers to that provocative. Firstly, stylistically, there is literally nothing else like JoJo's. The weird fusion of Japanese shonen over-the-top flair coupled with Western pop cultural references is already an eclectic mix, but then Araki's writing comes in to make things even more chaotic. But the second reason is that JoJo's Bizarre Adventure is constantly changing things up. Instead of being split up into arcs with one central cast like a lot of other battle shonen, there are various parts that each tell their own story using a largely original new cast of characters each time. Of the 9 parts of the manga that have been published, 6 have been adapted by David Productions over the last decade. But not all JoJo's is made equal, so today I'm putting those 6 parts into order from my least favourite to my favourite. I'm only going to be talking about the adaptations of the mainline manga that have been done by David Productions, so this will not be including the original Stardust Crusaders OVA from the 1980s, nor the Kishibe Rohan spin-off, although I will say the latter is pretty good. I'm also not ranking these based on how good of an adaptation they were. I am judging these anime as their own individual, self-contained anime. Though a bit of continuity of the other parts is always a nice touch. To completely judge how good I find these, I am going to have to invoke a pretty heavy spoiler warning for basically every part I talk about, so you have been warned. I should mention I'm not as invested in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure as others. This is evident in the fact that the anime is my only entry point to JoJo's. I haven't done some of the things that JoJo's superfans are into, like I haven't read the manga, or watched the original OVA, or given another man a blowjob. So I'm just going to put this out there. This ain't just a hot take, this is the outright wrong opinion, and will probably be the worst take on JoJo since the fucking Basement Order. For all the fancy words I'm going to try and use to justify myself, this is really just based on how much I personally enjoyed each part. I ain't here to fight, because that would imply that I could. That being said though, told you the takes were a bit peppy. Okay, so JoJo's Part 3 is what most people think of when they think JoJo's, and rightfully so. It was the introduction of stands, and that deserves a hefty lumping of praise. Hamon was starting to feel a little half-baked over only 24 episodes, so swapping that out for abilities that could take the form of literally anything is the shot in the arms that the fights needed. On top of this, voice actors killed it as usual, but I fucking love Polnareff, especially as a character, really undergoing a lot of change in their arc, though that's not to talk down on Jotaro though, because there is a reason he is the most prolific of all the Joestars, being the stone-faced brick shithouse who takes everything seriously, and that just makes everything so much better. It's also through him that the goals, world, and stakes are established incredibly efficiently in only 3 episodes. I know what's happening, what needs to happen, and why, but therein lies the problem. This is a very straightforward motion between beginning and ending, without many revelations in between, and each episode follows a very similar structure. Gang goes somewhere, odd shit starts happening, it must be the work of an enemy stand user. They find the stand user, beat down. This gets very repetitive structurally, and especially when a lot of the episodes become 2-parters. Now, these fights are engaging, both because I like the characters, and because the mind games aspect is always well written, but I can't say that it doesn't get extremely predictable. Having said all that, the actual enemies that are repeated are quite entertaining, since we get a bit of personality on the ones who show up more than once, notably Enya Baba, Whole Horse, and the Oigo Boingo brothers. This is also Yugo Kanno's first time doing the soundtrack, and they did a great job creating theme songs so iconic that they would be used in later parts of JoJo's as well. On top of this part easily has the best collection of EDs in JoJo, and on my first time seeing Last Train Home I knew, oh yeah, this is gonna come back and hit me in the feels at the end. And I was right. The ending of the show itself was a satisfying one, even if it did feel a long time coming, as while Dio's presence is nothing compared to what they were in Phantom Blood, they are still a threat, and watching the painstaking effort that the Stardust Crusaders have to go to in order to defeat him made the final beatdown all that more iconic, although the impact of Avdol's death is very much diminished by the fake out the first time that they quote-unquote died. Stardust Crusaders is undoubtedly the most battle shonen of all JoJo's parts, but even amongst most battle shonen, it stands proudly above them. But examining the pacing is where you realize that this is basically like if in The Wizard of Oz, Dorothy and the gang left the Emerald City, and then they had to start fighting the flying monkeys for 50 scenes before we're allowed to meet the witch. Also in this reality, Toto looked like this, and Dorothy looked like this, and the wizard looked like... Let's just move on before this metaphor gets any more complicated. With every Mario Kart franchise, there must be a Super Mario Kart. With every Titanfall franchise, there must be a Titanfall 1. And with every JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, there must be a Phantom Blood. The first one that no one is willing to claim as their favourite, or even as part of the lineage in some cases. And that is a crying shame, because Phantom Blood has more than enough merits both on its own and as a part of the wider JoJo's narrative. It's undoubtedly more macabre than most of the other JoJo's parts, but the tone is something that works in favour of this show instead of against it, with this being able to have the audience take the proceedings quite seriously, despite the fact that it is by all means a story about a Victorian gentleman learning sun kung fu so he can kill his vampire stepbrother. But speaking of that vampire stepbrother, I prefer this incarnation of Dio above the Stardust Crusaders version. In Stardust Crusaders, Dio was certainly a threat and absolutely worked great as a villain, but narratively he just felt like the big bad who was at the logical end of the power scale. Phantom Blood's Dio, on the other hand, is a character who was made perfectly to complement the Joestar he's fighting. Yes, he's a complete bastard from the word go, but the narrative doesn't just decide, oh, he killed a dog, we'll just leave it at that. They show Dio's lust for power by any means necessary, and how this causes Jonathan to realize that they must become the gentleman that his father always wanted him and Dio to become. Jonathan's noble humility is what I think makes him such a fascinating character, as he knows where he came from, and yet he knows he must forge his own path. It sets the idea of greatness not just because of who you are, but what you do in motion, where it'll be present in every part going forward. Yeah, I'll talk about Speedwagon there. Speedwagon being best girl is something I'm sure we all know, but the problem is that he's sort of the only other real memorable character in Phantom Blood, as he's the only one who shows up in more than 3 episodes. On the opposite end of the spectrum for the longest part, Phantom Blood is easily the shortest at 9 episodes, and the complete opposite of Stardust Crusaders' problem is in effect. In Phantom Blood, while the moments that need to hit absolutely do, everything in between feels kind of rushed. It also doesn't help that it has the most forgettable soundtrack of the lot. That being said, it easily has my favourite opening, with Sonochi no Sadame really setting the cheesy yet epic scale of things into motion, and showing that this story from the 80s can still find ways of getting people excited. Phantom Blood may not have started as the rest of it went on, but it told an interesting story with a great central dynamic between its protagonist and antagonist, while whetting the audience's appetite for what came next. And indeed, what came next was... Pardon, I meant to say next in the Joestar bloodline, not next chronologically. Should have really fucking specified that one. Now, everyone and their mother has talked about how this Italiano mafioso JoJo is oh so marveloso, but how does it stack up against the other parts? Well, Golden Wind is far and away the nicest looking part, as the fight choreography goes hard, but the Italian setting helps to add a bit of charm, and so do the little bits of physicality sprinkled in, which, given that it's JoJo's, aren't all that little. But as for the JoJo themselves, or rather the JoJo acting as the poster child, I've had some time to think about Giorno. In my 2018 Anime Awards, I named Giorno Giovanna as my protagonist of the year, and 5 years later, I can now say with confidence, fuck right off. I suppose my heightened reaction comes from the fact that this was the same year Bunny Girl Senpai came out, and the idea that I snubbed Sakata, one of my favourite anime protagonists of all time, in the name of this hardcore gangstar crapper is something I'm kicking myself about. Now, Giorno's problem is not that they're an unlikable character, but more so that they're just too powerful for their own good. Every JoJo's protagonist is powerful in some way, true, but most of them have more to their character than just a repeated monologue. This is a shame because Bucciarati undoubtedly makes for a more interesting protagonist than Giorno. They actually do things instead of just saying that they're going to do them, and on top of that, it feels like he has more on the line. However, I'm not going to rant on Giorno too much because, as mentioned, they're not a bad character, just a slightly predictable one, and they do actually make up for this slightly overpowered protagonist, because for one, they give him an appropriate distance from fights, but also they make sure that to balance this, they make the villain the most OP motherfucker on the planet as well. The boss feels like the perfect rupture to the proceedings once we're getting comfortable with the rhythm of Golden Wind, because this person has nothing to do with the group of people that the gang have been fighting, and is instead a malevolent outside force that even those that have been chasing the gang seem to be afraid of. Some would say that it might not work to have such a terrifying presence be given so much screen time, as it would risk deflating all the tension, but this 21st century schizoid man always finds a way to keep the audience on their toes, and you never know what they're going to do next. The plot is structured rather nicely to complement this unpredictability, with the objective changing in 3 succinct acts, and the enemies becoming more and more threatening as time goes on, still putting its foot on the pedal and making sure the audience never gets bored as it goes through this story. On top of this, the gang has more than enough time for all of them, okay, 2/3 of them, to have some very amusing antics. Though speaking of memeable moments, JoJo's theme still bangs, easily the best Joestar theme, capturing the suave yet crazy nature of Golden Wind perfectly. But to end talking about Golden Wind, let me talk about how it ended. This ending is by far the most nuanced way it could have done things, as it doesn't go out with a bang, but with a reflection. And that somewhat works, though it does need a shitload of explanation to make sense. For a part that people won't stop yelling about, I'm glad that they used a quieter note to finish. To me, Golden Wind is a lot like Stardust Crusaders, but if given better pacing, even if slightly less interesting characters. That analogy doesn't do it justice though, because the overall quality of this part makes me a little ashamed to have this in my bottom half of the list. And it almost wasn't, since 3rd place was a toss-up between this and Stone Ocean was one that was certainly hampered by its Netflix exclusivity and the almost year-long hiatus it took. But that was a while ago, and I'm here to view it as the cohesive whole, not the odd trilogy that Netflix made it. Now, to address the elephant in the room, while I am not of the belief that the CGI is overused, when it is used, it does feel a little disappointing. But that being said, even when CGI is employed, the stand design is always up to the Iraqi standard, if not beyond it. The story is what ultimately inched this over Golden Wind, because Stone Ocean probably has the most compelling narrative out of any part. Throughout the whole story, there's this undertone of desperation from both the protagonists and the antagonists, with Green Dolphin Street Prison acting as a great pressure cooker environment of the opening parts of the narrative. As for the protagonist, by the way, Joylene herself is one of the reasons that I believe this is the closest JoJo's ever gets to recapturing the tone of part 1, because like Jonathan, a lot of her journey is about self-improvement through self-discovery. At the start of this part, she's just a pawn in someone else's wider scheme, trying to get out of the whole ordeal, but gradually realizes that she can save more than just herself. And this, I think, is one of the saving graces of the cast of Stone Ocean, because the rest of them I find merely okay, with the exception of FF, who is, oh god, why'd they have to die? But another reason for the part 1 comparison is because of the aforementioned dread and desperation that seeps through the whole thing. The tone is already darkened by the capturing of Jotaro's discs only a few episodes in, but gradually the bizarreness scales back enough to the point that even the narrator is getting philosophical. The future of these characters becomes very unclear, both heroes and villains fighting tooth and nail down to the last minute, and you have no idea who's going to win, especially when Pucci, in a way, does. And that's one part of why Pucci is probably my favourite villain in JoJo's. The other part is that Pucci is a villain whose inner workings you get to see much more vividly. He doesn't just lust for power like Dio or the Pillar Men, nor is he aiming to keep getting away with it like Diavolo or Kira. This is someone with a calling, who realized they were the only one who could achieve their mission, and now will go to literally any length to achieve it. And the fact that we don't know what this heaven of theirs looks like until it's already too late is how we're able both to feel like we know what Pucci wants, while still feeling terrified about everything we don't know about them. Some of this is helped by the fact Pucci has a great theme song behind him, and I feel this is Yugo Kanno's best soundtrack. While the ED for Stone Ocean is mid, the openings go pretty hard, especially as it gets to the last bits of the part, because I will say that no JoJo's opening has given me more goosebumps than the reveal of the Joestar Mansion in the remix of the second opening. However, none of the references at the end of Stone Ocean felt egregious, they just felt like the culmination of everything that had come before it. This is still Joylene's story, even if the end of it not only concluded her chapter, but the previous 5 as well. Stone Ocean is the part that I will largely remember for its ending, but that's perfectly fine with me, because that ending and the build-up into the 3rd act of that story were masterfully crafted, and it helped that the beginning was pretty solid too. As I've said before, if David Productions chose to stop adapting JoJo's now that they've done everything from the original Phantom Blood universe, I would not blame them. They certainly went out on a high note. So as you can probably guess, the next part I mention will confirm what my favourite part of JoJo's is by process of elimination. And it was not the most painstaking decision I ever made, I'm afraid to say, but I will say that this next part is by far the most unique one out of the 6, and even the one above it doesn't feel as distinct from the rest of the JoJo's canon as this one does. You can probably guess which one I'm talking about now. The fact that you now already know how the rest of this video is going to go aside, part 4 is a massive change of pace for JoJo's. It's not the story of a bizarre adventure, just the story of a bizarre town, a crazy noisy one to be specific. And in this town we find easily the best wider cast in any JoJo's part. While Josuke himself is merely okay as the main Joestar, being entertaining but not even approaching the heights of the other Joestars, he is but one character out of many the story focuses on. The things that Stardust Crusaders did best are transferred and then amplified in Diamond is Unbreakable. These aspects being the strength of its core cast and the reincorporation of its wider cast, but this time put in a more slice-of-life context. The primary cast have characters that can make any episode interesting no matter who the primary character they use is, and the recurring characters become more charming with each recurring appearance. One of the lesser praised qualities of Araki's writing is his ability to create interesting locations that aren't necessarily real, but still feel like they have history to them. Everything from Wind Knight Slot to Green Dolphin Street Prison are evidence enough of this, but Morio is his magnum opus when it comes to making a living, breathing world from scratch. Every inch of this town has a story to it, and some of the beauty spots allow Araki to further show off his creativity. I mean, Osun. It's like Lawson, but with 2 letters changed. This man is a fucking genius. The story never goes beyond Morio, but because it never has to, there are more than enough things to do in this town. Because another aspect of how this has the best world building of any part is that this is where the implications of stand users in the universe of JoJo's are put up front and center. Not every quote-unquote battle has to be a fight, but can take the form of just a game, a meal, or a trap which they have to navigate out of. What's all important to these is the tension, and this is treated as the main objective in many of these scenes. Be it an actual fight all the way to just Josuke trying to open a bank account, scenes leave you on the edge of your seat no matter the actual stakes. Although this, once again, is helped immensely by the amazing cast of characters. I love everyone, from Rohan to Koichi to Okuyasu to Yukako. The only bad thing I can say about the cast of Diamond is Unbreakable is that the appearances of some of the other Joestars in this part slightly ruins their appearances in other parts. For example, you know that wonderful moment in Stardust Crusaders where we see Joseph still deeply cares for Suzy Q? Yeah, he had been cheating on her ass with a younger girl who ended up pregnant with his bastard child. Also, while we're here, did you know that while Jotaro was in Morio, he was emotionally neglecting his wife and 5-year-old daughter? Yeah, it doesn't make things seem quite as whimsical as they are in this part. But those interpretations are merely something between or even beyond the lines, and what's on the lines is absolutely brilliant. And one of the crowning achievements of this cast is the principal antagonist, Yoshiage motherfucking Kira. Kira has a bit of a tall order when it comes to a JoJo's villain. Amongst a pantheon of other villains that include literal gods, a vampire who harnessed the power of said gods, a mafia don with control over time itself, the man who ended the world, and you thought I was going to mention another villain, but it was him, Dio, you start to wonder how they're going to make a dime a dozen Psycho seem threatening, especially as he doesn't even show up until halfway through. Despite only having the latter part of the narrative to make an impression, Kira more than makes up for it by setting to work proving that it isn't about power, it's about presence. We know that Kira is beatable pretty early on, but every time they're on screen, you can't help but feel that no one is safe. And just after he's killed 2 of the minor cast, they introduce a family for Kira to cuckoo his way into, producing several episodes of some of the most chilling shit you'll see in JoJo's. By the time he's actually defeated, he's become one of the most intentionally detestable characters in anime, and that is impressive for someone who only 20 episodes earlier was just some geezer with a hand fetish. Yes, we might know who's behind everything with about 20 episodes to spare, and that certainty is somehow even scarier than if it had been kept a secret. Some might think that this lack of mystery regarding the latter half is a point against Diamond is Unbreakable, but not every ending has to be a mystery. For example, it's no mystery as to what part I'm going to talk about after this sentence. You already know what my next line is going to be. Part 2 has so much I can say about it, yet also so much I can't even begin to find the words to describe. So, where am I going to start with this? The music. I understand how wrong this feels to be using the soundtrack as major leverage as to why this is my favourite part of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but JoJo's has a sonic identity as well as a visual one, and Battle Tendency was the only time JoJo's has collaborated with one of the most sonically individual composers in anime, Taku Iwasaki. From the word go, the soundtrack is hitting you with funk, before switching gears to cool with a leitmotif borrowed from Araki's own inspirations, and then deciding, hey, you know that character who only appears for 4 episodes tops? Let's give him one of the coolest themes out there. While Yugo Kanno is great, I'm a little sad that Taku Iwasaki was not able to continue with their streak of kick-ass JoJo's soundtracks, but that just makes me appreciate what's here even more. This is easily one of my favourite anime soundtracks of all time, but it's not only the soundtrack that's pleasing to the ears, because the voice acting here is the fucking tops. JoJo's has always had a great track record with voice acting, but here, most of all. Maybe it's the odd English inflections that Joseph has. Maybe it's the way Stroheim rolls their R's. Or maybe it's literally just fucking everything about this moment. JoJo's is at its best when it's over the top, and there is nothing that is under the top in Battle Tendency. Everything here feels like it's turned up to 100% while still aiming to be the best it can be. And no element sums this up better than Joseph Joestar himself. Joseph starts off as a ball of sheer charisma, masking the fact that his Hamon is little more than a party trick. But through the course of Battle Tendency, we see him forced to use his noggin against more and more formidable foes, and at points suffering major setbacks. As much as we meme on Joseph telling us what his favourite kind of salad is, it's that critical moment of anguish at the death of his friend, while also the fear instilled in him over the formidability of the challenge, yet the anger he feels that drives him to fight, that makes the character even more three-dimensional. Of any of the main JoJo's parts, this features the most characters from previous parts, as effectively the whole of the cast from Phantom Blood, minus its principal 2, show up, but they do not use this as an excuse to wallow in references to the previous part. But instead, Battle Tendency only uses Phantom Blood as a jumping off point, where what was established in the previous part can be used to show the stakes that have been upped from Phantom Blood. The focus is still on the characters introduced in Battle Tendency, and they are all memorable for the right reasons. It's the last time that Hamon is the main fighting style used, and Araki must have realised that they weren't planning on going forward with it, because they make sure that they get the most out of Hamon one last time. They also tried experimenting with having battles won through means that aren't just fights, but also some fights that are made into chases, races, and trials, instead of just simply who can beat the shit out of each other the quickest. But this very much feels like Araki closing the curtain on the Hamon saga with one fell swoop, and an effective fell swoop at that. As much as I love the approach that Araki had to ending Part 6, which can be best described as third impacting that shit, there is still something to be said for endings that tie up everything in a nice little bow, and no bow is wound tighter than the ending of Battle Tendency. We learn what happened to every character from Part 1 and Part 2, and I feel genuinely happy for them. But then, just as we're getting comfortable, they set up the next part in a way that leaves us all in anticipation. Battle Tendency was the first part that the JoJo's anime felt like it truly achieved a voice of its own beyond just what it was adapting. This was the moment it went beyond Araki's illustration and writing to form the identity it has today. I can't find a way to talk about Battle Tendency at length, since that would run against the idea of this show, which is the perfect length. It tells its story, keeps us entertained throughout, blows a few minds with its twists, and then ends perfectly. To say any more would risk doing Battle Tendency dirty with bad description on my part. And I can't find much to say against it. Apart from the fact that the title sucks. Seriously, what the fuck does Battle Tendency even mean? But with that over, there's just one thing I need to say before the end of this video. Yes, this whole thing has been a JoJo's reference.